Okay, so one of the things I just wanted to take a moment and say that I appreciate Dr. Toro, Mr. Williams, and Dr. Gifford for their opening comments before we got going with the conference. They also allowed me some time to get myself back centered because I had my whole plan on how I was gonna, come in here and bang, 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 bang for facilitation, and then you guys hit me with the Matthew Rivera dedication. So I feel like I'm back on solid ground. And so let's get into our first presentation of the day. We have a keynote presentation by Dr. BEEBE and Dr. DIVIETRO. Let me read a little bit about them, and then they're going to get into their presentation. Both Dr. BEEBE and Dr. DIVIETRO are research scientists at the Injury Prevention Center. The mission of the Injury Prevention Center, IPC, at Connecticut Children's is to reduce unintentional injury and violence among Connecticut residents. The IPC translates research into injury prevention programs and policy. Focus areas for pediatric injury prevention. The IPC has 3 focus areas: intimate partner violence, teen driving safety, and youth suicide. Please join me in welcoming Dr. BEEBE and Dr. DIVIETRO.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. Hello, my name is Susie DIVIETRO. Thank you so much for inviting myself and Rebecca BEEBE here. I'm just going to dive right in. All right. Okay, so on the agenda for today, we're going to start off talking about cultural norms of fatherhood and masculinity, and talk about the ways that those cultural norms really inform the approach for fatherhood and how we can potentially work to engage fathers more extensively into these various systems that we're going to talk about. Then we'll get into some barriers to engagement, and then we'll leave you with some engagement strategies. So hopefully you'll leave the session with having a better idea of some ways to improve your engagement with fathers. But before we dive in, I figured I'd tell you who we are. Rebecca and I have had much the same career path. We met in graduate school. We were both medical anthropologists. So what that means is that we care about culture. And because we're medical anthropologists, we also care about how culture intersects with things like health and well-being. So you'll see the influence of culture throughout this presentation. We're also research scientists. We are research scientists for the Injury Prevention Center at Connecticut Children's Medical Center. And what that means is that we care about research, we care about evidence and data. That is our day-to-day, is what we're doing. Excuse me. And so the vast majority of this presentation really comes from what we've learned through our years of doing this research. And a big project that we've worked on for the past 6 years has been with the Department of Children and Families. We've been helping them to facilitate their program for families impacted by violence. So their IPV FAIR program, which is intimate partner violence, excuse me, family assessment, intervention, response. And so a lot of what we've learned in facilitating and helping to evaluate that program is what comes into the content of this presentation. So I just want to give a big shout out to all of the IPV FAIR providers throughout the life of that program and that are here today, because we've learned so much from the providers of that program, and also to all of the intimate partner violence specialists in the Department of Children and Families. We've also learned so much from them throughout the course of this project. We're also college professors. We teach anthropology at Trinity College, which means it keeps us current in what is happening for a particular sector of young adults. It also means that we both have the unique opportunity to watch our students excel and do really amazing things, such as my student, Matthew Rivera, who gave the dedication this morning. So I'm extremely proud of Matthew, and it's really great to see him in this role. So thank you, Matthew. And we're also domestic violence advocates. So we have been trained in advocacy as well. So that also informs the presentation. And while this presentation isn't specifically about violence, it is really about fatherhood. That is going to inform how we approach the topic because of that background. So let's dive in. So father engagement. So we know that father engagement is a critical part of many social interventions. We've seen a real growing interest in fatherhood since the early 2000s. So in 2002, they put out the Responsible Fatherhood narrative from the White House, and you really start to see how there's a movement to really expand the role of fathers and expand what the expectations are for fatherhood. We've also seen in the last 20 years a real explosion into the research about fatherhood. And what we've learned through this research is that really, despite differences in methods, age groups, family constellation, most studies really confirm what we pretty much already knew, which is that fathering really does matter. The father-child relationship is really critical to important developmental outcomes, such as cognitive development, social competence, psychopathology. Fathers also make unique contributions to development over and above the contributions that mothers make in terms of depression, behavioral problems, also really long-term indicators of things like happiness, life satisfaction, and psychological distress. They also help, having a fatherhood role helps with things like impulse control and memory. And interestingly, the amount of time that a dad spends with his children is a particularly strong predictor of how empathetic a child will become. And we know how critical empathy is to the working of a lot of these things. So we're going to talk about empathy quite a bit towards the end of the presentation. So also, in addition to this, the literature that has really shown the importance of fatherhood, we see that there's also a growing body of work that has demonstrated that fathers are often not addressed in case plans, and that caseworkers' negative attitudes and agencies' overall low expectations for fathers often discourages fatherhood engagement. So how do we define fathers? And what goes into this definition? So does it involve caretaking? And what does caretaking mean? What are the components of caretaking? Does it involve things like changing diapers? Does it involve cooking, cleaning? What are the components of caretaking that go into this definition of fatherhood? And is it just biological fathers? We spend a lot of times in the literature, the bio dad is really privileged. Certainly in a lot of case planning, the bio dad can be privileged, but there are lots of other kinds of dads out there that we need to be paying attention to because they're continuously exerting an influence in families' lives and in the lives of children. Are they single or married? And we'll get into a little later about sort of the implications for single or married and how many of the social services are set up in ways that discourage things like marriage, because that would make it so you're don't have access to some of those resources. And then are they cohabitating or custodial? I'll get into what custodial, the definitions for custodial, but are they living together? And what are the implications of living together? And what do we assume about the partners that don't live together that makes it so that we approach cases ostensibly differently, depending on whether they're cohabitating or not? Excuse me. Single fathers raising their children alone and non-custodial fathers are the fastest growing groups of dads. And also we have stay-at-home fathers. The census just started counting them for the first time in 2003. They make up about 3% of all stay-at-home parents are stay-at-home dads. So non-custodial fathers, non-custodial just means that they don't have physical custody of their children. About a quarter of them share custody and 2/3 have some contact with their kids. So this includes divorced dads, separated, dads who've been incarcerated, birth fathers of adopted children. In 2018, there were 22 million American children had a parent living outside of the home, which represented over a quarter of children under the age of 21. So that's a lot of kids. So we need to make sure that we're really including them, including these non-custodial dads. Being non-custodial does not mean being uncaring or unfit or not present. Many non-custodial dads are very highly involved in their children's lives. Unfortunately, when we've done some the literature, you see the focus groups with CPS workers, when they describe non-custodial dads, the words that they use are marginal and afterthought. Now, Black caseworkers were 50% more likely than white caseworkers to hold more positive views of non-custodial fathers. Also, caseworkers that had had more years of experience and that had had training specifically about locating and engaging fathers, they held more positive views of non-custodial dads as well. What was really interesting about this study, it was a regional analysis as well. They were collecting data in Arizona, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Tennessee, and they found that in Minnesota was the caseworkers held the most favorable views of fathers across the board. And they had also recently made some pretty extensive changes to how they handle case processing. So they changed from doing traditional investigations to doing non-adversarial family assessments and really put in some architecture to include families in decision-making. So the idea is that some of these large-scale policy changes have also impacted the way that the caseworkers were approaching fathers and the way that they were thinking about and conceptualizing fatherhood in connection to their cases. We also know that historically there have been a lot of services that are set up in ways that privilege moms. We also know that there is some bias against men who need support and who need to reach out for support and to need social services. Within child welfare, it's well known that case files are often open in mom's name. Sometimes dads aren't listed in the case files anywhere. This can be particularly troubling for cases that are open as a result of domestic violence. So if there is a domestic violence incident and there is a male perpetrator and a female victim, but the child welfare case is only open in the mom's name, then the onus for doing something about that is put on moms, which is pretty unfair, particularly in the context of intimate partner violence. So TANF, which is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, that cash assistance, these rules for TANF also exclude men in marriage. If you're married, you simply don't qualify for TANF. And if you're a man that has some financial resources, TANF actually provides a lot of disincentives to maintain a biological family. Also WIC, which is Women, Infants, and Children. This is the Supplemental Nutrition Program. It says it right there in the name, women and infants. It does exclude dads. We know that men play a really important role influencing maternal health behaviors, but they're really often not encouraged to participate. There was a WIC office that tried to integrate involving fatherhood and involving fathers to try to promote breastfeeding. It was quite successful, but it's very infrequent for any WIC programs to really do a lot to integrate men into the system. Dads are often judged simply for needing help. And in terms of the WIC system, they report not feeling welcomed, being ignored, and WIC being unequal in their treatment of men and women. Within the homeless shelter system, the shelters were really set up without the fatherhood role in mind. So there are often very, very few family beds. So there are single person beds and there are mothers and children beds, but there are very, very few family beds to go around. So that really works to exclude dads from the family. So what we see as a result of this is that dads are often discounted for their contributions and treated as incapable, incorrigible, or irrelevant. So where does this come from? Well, a lot of this is driven by cultural norms that we have for a family. So what constitutes a norm or a good family is going to have an impact on how we participate and how we think about fathers and fatherhood. We're starting to redefine family in some ways. So we know that we can take into consideration things like extended families. Is this multi-generational? Is it a heterosexual family? Are there grandparents involved? We're starting to see some more fluidity in terms of family forms with the integration of same-sex households. But even a lot of the intact cohabitating or not cohabitating families often fall into similar patterns of cultural expectations of parenting, where moms are generally responsible for children in the home and fathers are responsible for financial needs. Now, one of the ways that we can try to understand this, there's this great book written by Carol Stack, All Our Kin, and she was really writing in response to the Moynihan Report that was produced by the government in 1965. And the Moynihan Report really was, it took a bunch of national data and it concluded that the Black family was dysfunctional and in disarray. So Carol Stack really wanted to take this on and she wanted to explore the validity of those conclusions. And she wanted to know if the official data that was used in that report missed some really important aspects of the lived experiences of Black families, and particularly poor Black families. So she spent several years researching. She was an anthropologist. She did participant observation. So she was able to see the inner workings of family structure from the inside, or the EMIC perspective for my anthropologists out there, in a way that's not really possible necessarily if you're just looking at statistical data. So she was really able to get in there and learn about all the different ways that these families were functioning. And one of the real findings from this was this idea that we really need to disentangle form from function. So we generally will assume that only one form is going to provide the function that we expect from an institution. So for families, we assume that the two-parent nuclear family, that's the only form that will get us the function that we want. But if we focus only on that form, then we miss all of the creative ways that people develop other practices and other norms that can really provide the same function. So even if the alternatives don't necessarily perform ideally, they could be the best option available. And they can also point us into different directions for changes in policy or changes to other institutions to help us improve our outcomes. She showed us how family-related policy in particular needs to pay attention to bottom-up sources of social order, particularly in the context of Black and Brown communities and immigrant communities, where histories of poverty, current discrimination, and the legacy of slavery have produced a wider variety of family structures, and they're responding to poverty and discrimination in reasonably effective ways. So now this is the part where I'm asking for some audience participation. So if you could please take out your cellular phones. I'm going to ask you this question. I'd like you to respond. So you just text Rebecca BEEBE 662 to 37607 and then text your answer to this question. What are the characteristics of a good man? This is the most technical part of the presentation, so. Let's see. I'm not seeing any yet. Oh yes, the number is 37607. I'll give a couple minutes. Ah, there's a few coming in. So what does it mean? What are the characteristics of a good man? Okay, so far I've only gotten one. I got two. So the idea is that there's so many people who have this beautiful word cloud. I'll give it another minute. Oh, they're coming in. Thank you for participating. Give another couple minutes. You've got some really good ones. Actually, I wonder if I can show you right now what it's looking like. So I can show you in real time how these things are moving along. Emotional, honest, strong, hardworking, willing. Oh, this is a fun word cloud. Honest. All right. Well, I can stop there. Thank you so much for participating. So what are the characteristics of a good man? We have hardworking, listener, compassionate, understanding, good, honest is that. So the bigger the word, the more people put it in there. So a lot of people valuing honesty. Emotional. So that's a surprising one to have in there. So we'll talk about how we've really changed some of these constructs of gender, or we're trying to change some of these constructs of gender. Responsible, provider, support, reliable, thoughtful, hardworking, dedicated, supportive, involved, responsibility. I love all these words. Family, loyalty, excellent. So I just wanted to start us to kind of think about what do those components mean and how do they intersect with our feelings about fatherhood as well. So some of the, let's put that over there. Okay. So some of the norms, the traditional norms of masculinity that we see in terms of things that maybe impede our ability to really open up this version of masculinity that we want to see. Some of the cultural norms of masculinity is that traditionally they've not really been allowed to be vulnerable. Boys are often taught that anger is really the only acceptable emotion, so they're not really offered the full range of emotions. And they also glorify, so in the media, definitely there's glorification of male aggression and sexual exploitation. There's a great TED Talk about the man box by Tony Porter. If anyone has not seen it, we thought about showing it, but I thought maybe in this crowd, people have probably already seen it. The man box is just, is this idea of the rigid set of expectations and perceptions of behaviors of what it means to be a man or manly behavior. So it's just a reminder that gender is a socially defined construct. And so part of it is for men is that you don't burden them with your problems. But again, your idea of what it means to be a man or woman comes from your experiences and the messages that you get from others. And so the man box, which is, sort of creates this idea of being stoic and unemotional or strong or aggressive, also comes with it this idea of viewing women as objects. And what we know is that from research from the World Health Organization, so international research shows that men and boys who adhere to these rigid traditional notions of masculinity are more likely to report having used violence against a partner. And this is hierarchical, right? This is a hierarchy. And so it marginalizes men who don't perfectly fit the description of a real man. And because no man actually fits the description perfectly, all men are limited by this. And what we've known from feminist circles, that gender constructs constrain women. We also know that gender constructs constrain men as well. And that these constructs are really policed as well. The idea about acceptable masculinity is policed. So fatherhood then. So what did fatherhood look like? What were the older kind of constructions of what fatherhood meant? It was a construction of low expectations. So really doing anything was really celebrated. And really the only thing you're expected to do was provide economic support. And so the subtext of this is that if you don't provide the economic support, then you're not a real man. And also that it excludes all of the other needs that children have beyond just economic support. It excludes their emotional needs, their intellectual needs, their physical needs. It excludes all kinds of other needs that we know that children have. We also know that all cultures have attitudes that support responsible fatherhood. For instance, it was long generally believed that machismo was associated with excessive masculinity and aggression and chauvinism, and they would portray machismo fathers as being really dominant or withdrawn or tyrannical disciplinarians. Now, there's really not much data to actually support that construction. And what we find in the literature is that Mexican origin fathers who are more Mexican identified are more likely to engage their children in what are considered feminine typed activities such as reading. And so really stress the positive aspects of machismo, also known as caballerismo, of dignity and honor, respect, and the importance of family responsibility. So studies have found that fathers with higher levels of this positive machismo had children who actually reported that their fathers were more involved in their lives. So it suggests a positive relationship between traditional Mexican values with its emphasis on positive family relationships and positive father involvement. So really, can we address the ways in which cultural factors influence fathering skills and influence motivation and identity? And how can we really tap into these positive cultural norms to really enhance the way that we engage with fathers? What about fatherhood today? So as I mentioned at the start, the White House has put out a few statements about fatherhood. They released promoting responsible fatherhood to encourage all fathers to take responsibility for their children in 2012. And they said that this involves taking responsibility for a child's intellectual, emotional, and financial well-being by making a choice to be an active and engaged parent, which sounds great, right? This is an excellent iteration, right? An expansion of the idea of what constitutes fatherhood, to be engaged and active. So that is a nice expansion of the idea of fatherhood. We also know that when we talk to fathers, fathers know what it means to be a good father. They know that there's more that is expected of them than just money. And they also want to be good fathers. So when the program that we facilitate with IPV Fair and with Fathers for Change, and I just realized I forgot to give a shout out to Carla Stover at the start. I meant to shout her out. She is the model developer for Fathers for Change and Mothers and More. And the premise of this is really that fathers want to be people who want to be good dads. And so that motivation is really strong, and you can use that motivation of wanting to be a good dad to help motivate for other things, like to become nonviolent or to help with misuse of substances. So this is such a strong force. This desire to be a good dad is really strong that we need to work to effectively harness it. So what is the problem then? So this is where we started. I'll come back to it. So fatherhood engagement is critical, but in a 2015 study, fathers felt that being a male put them at a disadvantage. And that social workers often took the side of the mom. So we've started to expand the understanding of dads beyond the exclusively financial role, or at least now we understand that we need to do this, and we're starting to take steps to engage fathers. But we also understand that we need to move away from focusing on the negative aspects of traditional gender role construction and focus on more positive aspects of masculinity. So starting to really reframe traditional masculinity as positive. We also know that we should be working from a place that's trauma-informed and strengths-based, but often a lot of the literature still reflects a negative or deficit framework. So often much of the research on fatherhood still examines things like negative consequences rather than coming from that strength-based focus. So what happened? Well, we reframed the ideal about fatherhood. We started to expand the definition of fatherhood to include emotional needs and psychological needs of children. However, we didn't really reframe masculinity. So we didn't reframe these contexts of what it means to be a man, but at the same time, we've changed what it meant to be a father. We've done a much better job of integrating women into the workplace than we've done at integrating men into the family, especially into the lives of children in the non-intact family. So functional definitions of mother and fatherhood. So we've started to move away from looking at the father as just the breadwinner and started to really open up what the definition means. However, when we look in the literature, we find that men still tend to earn more than women in heterosexual two-parent households. And in white heterosexual dual-income households, women still do the bulk of the childcare and household work. And also we know that when we talk to caseworkers, they're more likely to see fathers as less mature and to see mothers as naturally more nurturing. So fathers are viewed as being more violent, less involved, or for money only. And fathers are still viewed as discretionary and secondary helpers, whose primary responsibility is still breadwinning, while housework and emotional labor still remain sort of peripheral to that construction of fatherhood. Another problem with this idea of responsible fatherhood is that it really does privilege middle-class families and middle-class norms. For the most part, white and upper middle-class white men, they have the social capital as a result of their race and class, so they're actually allowed more flexibility in that gender performance. So fathers who are able to access more gender neutral or less functional approaches to fatherhood often frame it within the previous ideology of saying they're choosing to do this. But because they have these resources in terms of flexible job, economic standing, and time, because they have that social capital, it allows them more flexibility in some of these other categories. But then what ends up happening is that the old undesirable qualities of fatherhood get projected onto already marginalized groups and then rejected. So the research on fatherhood really stemmed from concerns of children born out of wedlock and in divorce, and increases in poverty and as a problem of fatherlessness. This was really framed as a problem of fatherlessness. But the research didn't really consider that it was more a product of twice the resources, and that in families of color with single mothers, there were often fewer parental resources to go around. So what this really does is that it stigmatizes poorer men of color when they don't resemble these professionally successful, married, residential fathers who are financially and economically involved with their children. It also ignores how socioeconomic obstacles such as structural racism have constrained parental involvement among low-income families of color. And it hides how class and race inequalities undermine marginalized men's parental involvement. This is really illustrated by this idea of the absent Black father. President Barack Obama famously gave a speech about, and this is something that's really in the narrative, where the absent Black father has long been blamed for disparities in education, income, employment, and incarceration. However, when we actually look at the literature, there's a CDC report that came out in 2013 that Black dads actually are more actively involved in their kids' lives than dads of other races. Black dads who live with their kids are more likely to provide physical care, such as changing diapers, bathing, and feeding, also more likely to read to their kids, help with homework, talk to them about their day, take them to activities than fathers of other races who live with their kids. And it's confirmed through maternal reports. So African-American father involvement is actually higher than the average and doesn't drop off when the relationship ends to the same extent that other races do. Excuse me. For dads who don't live with their kids, Black dads are more likely to be involved in their care, doing things like reading, helping with homework, talking to them than other non-cohabitating dads. Now, of course, there are studies that show that children who grew up in two-parent households perform better in school and are less likely to commit crime and have higher future earning opportunities. But this doesn't take into consideration the impact of depressed wages, chronic unemployment, discriminatory hiring practices, and the history of mass incarceration that really limits the opportunities of families. And I'm going to turn things over to Rebecca.
And I'm unmuted already. Excellent. All right. Thank you, Susie. So I'm just going to pick up where Susie left off and talk about the additional barriers to being a responsible father in this image Susie's been addressing. So the 4 barriers that I'm going to talk about briefly are structural racism, trauma, mental health, and shame. Next slide, please. So structural racism is a social system where race is a central principle of social organization and serves to advantage one race over another. And in the States, we see that the social structure privileges white people and disadvantages people of color. And what it means is that there are seemingly invisible forces that are just naturally occurring to limit opportunities and options for people of color. And that then can create an image that it is the way things are and not a product of structural racism and structural violence. And when we look at the data, we can see that there are barriers in place at every level of our social organization that limit opportunities for people of color. Next slide, please. So people of color make up about 30% of the US population and account for 60% of those who are incarcerated. There are about 19 million African-American males in the US, and more than 1 million are incarcerated, and another 1.2 million are on probation. We also see overrepresentation of Black families in the child welfare system, where at every level of the child welfare process, people of color face not only disproportion, but disparity with harsher outcomes. So we see more reports against families of color, more investigations with families of color, more substantiations with families of color, and we also see higher rates of child removal within families of color. In addition to the disparity in the child welfare system, it is mirrored in the criminal justice system with harsher charges and harsher sentencing for people of color. Next slide, please. What this means is it creates a foundation or a backdrop for many families that creates a legitimate mistrust of systems. It is a mistrust that stems from seeing and experiencing and hearing about family and friends who were marginalized and taken advantage of and disadvantaged by the system. And it can create feelings of hypervigilance and reluctance to engage in systems and make it hard to feel that you can protect your children and engage your children in a system when that system has violated you, your family, and you want to protect your kids, but you're being told that you have to be involved with systems. Next slide, please. So one of the other additional barriers facing fathers is trauma. And we don't often consider trauma when we're talking about fathers and talking about men. Often that conversation, particularly with men involved in social systems and social services, focuses on, as Susie mentioned, that is apparent in the literature, the negative impact of gender socialization. So aggression, aggressive behavior, or the violence of men, rather than the trauma of men and fathers. And what we know is that trauma is pervasive, it's extensive, and it's costly. The CDC ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, reported that over 60% of people in the United States had experienced at least one adverse child experience within their lifetime. Next slide, please. So I just want to give an example. So we, as Susie mentioned, we work with the Department of Children and Families with their intimate partner violence family assessment intervention response. And as part of, so it's the family assessment intervention response. And as part of that intervention, families who are experiencing where there's intimate partner violence that has been identified as a problem or as a risk to the children in the home or out of the home, those families are enrolled in IPV FAIR, and both parents receive extensive initial assessment. And one of those assessment tools is the structured traumatic event measurement tool. And it documents there's 24 adult traumas and 12 childhood traumas that all of the participants are asked about. And what we saw is that on average, the fathers in IPV FAIR endorsed 9 different types of trauma. And that's not 9 traumas. They experienced 9 traumas. It means they experienced 9 different types of trauma in their lifetime. And I'm not reporting on the frequencies because I didn't pull those numbers. And that is lifetime trauma. And then before the age of 18, the average was 4 types of trauma. And again, that's type of trauma, not occurrences of traumatic events. Next slide, please. So I wanted to show you what some of those traumatic events are. These are the lifetime traumatic events that fathers endorsed or reported that they had experienced after the age of 18. And you can see that I chose the ones that had the highest ratings or the highest percentage of people who said they had experienced them. And I think it's important to point out that over a third of the men involved in the program had reported being homeless. And over 40% had been in a bad car accident, and the just the amount of trauma experienced is extensive. And then for childhood traumas, next slide, please. You can see that almost half of the fathers in IPV FAIR had seen or heard of a family member being arrested or imprisoned. They had experienced being slapped or punched or kicked in the home, and almost a third reported that that happened to the extent that it left bruises or red marks. So we can see that the fathers who are involved in IPV FAIR have experienced a huge amount of childhood trauma in addition to lifetime trauma. And as, next slide, please. As I'm sure many of you know and have heard of, the childhood traumatic experiences create a host of long-term, lifelong problems, or can increase the likelihood of long-term lifetime problems, including heart disease, asthma, depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidal ideation, and death by suicide, in addition to intimate partner violence. It's a risk factor for intimate partner violence. We also know that there's a dose response of those traumatic events in childhood. So the more you have, the more likely you are to have negative consequences as a result of those traumas. And the original longitudinal study found that less than 10% of men had experienced 4 or more ACEs. And again, the average for the men in the IPV FAIR program was 4 types of trauma, 4 different types of trauma. So when you have that level of adverse childhood experiences, that affects your worldview. It can, it increases the mistrust of others. It can increase the inability to regulate emotions. It can also generate a sense of personal guilt or shame. And so I just want to return to what the program is. IPV FAIR is for families where intimate partner violence has risen to the level that the department sees it as a risk to the children. And that is, so when we first started IPV FAIR, the department was moving away from a victim-centric intervention model to a family-centric intervention model. And the move for providers to shift from working only with victims to working with men who use violence, or women who use violence, and families where there is violence, and working with all family members, that was a difficult shift. And there was fear, and there was hesitation. There was a little bit of just, how do we even do this? And what's interesting is that the American Psychological Association has recommendations and guidelines for working with women and children, for working with minority populations, and a wide, like, they have a list of people that they have guidelines for working with, except for men. And despite recognizing the need for that, those guidelines are still under development. Next slide, please. So men are experiencing trauma. They're experiencing trauma. Oh, sorry, can we just go back 1 second? I just want to point out that the generational embodiment and historical trauma, again, that's structural racism. That's the foundation in which all of the other adverse childhood experiences are occurring on top of. Thanks, Susie. So, as you all know, trauma can increase risk for mental health problems. And for men, there's some complicated, the literature and the behaviors around mental health for men are complicated. So we know that fewer men than women are diagnosed with depression. Rates are 50% higher among women. So I'm gonna do an impromptu exercise, or what do you participation. Can you write in the chat if you think that, what you think that is a result of? Do you think that women really have 50% higher rates of depression, or do you think something else might be going on? So women have 50% higher rates. Yes, all of these are exactly, yes. Underreporting, less men in services. And I saw also that depression in men looks different because, as Susie mentioned, men aren't given permission to be sad. I worked in a group home after college, and the boys, and I worked with boys, and that was anger. Anger was what they felt connected to. Anger was what they were able to express until they had lost every opportunity for expressing anger. And maybe after, I mean, it was a long time ago, so we were still doing physical restraints, but after that, and then it would be crying, and you would be able to have the conversation about the sadness that he was holding on to. But without the permission to be sad, or without knowing that being sad is allowed, it can be very complicated for men to express that. So we know that men have higher rates of alcohol use and alcohol use and abuse, higher rates of stress, higher rates of sexual dysfunction, and higher rates of death by suicide and suicide attempts. Men commit suicide at 4 times the rate of women, and suicide is the second most common cause of death for men in every age group between 10 and 39. Next slide, please. So men have mental health. Oops, that's my old slide. Sorry. Oh, we're back, sorry. So men experience trauma, and men are experiencing mental health problems, but we also know that men exhibit less help-seeking behaviors. There's a delay in engagement of services, there's early termination of services, and those can make it harder to re-engage in services. There is a negative, so the research talks about a negative correlation between help-seeking and income, whereas income goes down, so do help-seeking behaviors. But there was an interesting study that was done looking at intersectionality and teasing apart different demographics from that correlation. And when race and gender were added, the negative correlation remained for Black men, but not for white men. So as white men's income went down, their help-seeking behaviors did not go down, which might speak to what Susie was talking about with that social capital. And because they have white and male, they can be a little bit more flexible in their expression of needing help. In addition, men who experience depression symptoms are more likely to seek help. But that, when looked at from different demographics, the researchers found that it was much more true for men who identify as white, that recognizing symptoms of depression increased help-seeking behaviors, but that was not as true for men who identified as Mexican American. Next slide, please. So what that means is that for many men, there's no help seeking until something goes really wrong and there's some kind of crisis, which could be police coming to the house or child protective services coming to the house, or both. Or it could be a psychosomatic manifestation of the trauma, of the mental health issues, or it could be heart disease as a consequence of adverse childhood experiences. So the waiting for things to go really wrong then leaves men feeling even more powerless. So you've had traumatic experiences, you've experienced structural racism, you may have mental health problems, and now you have people telling you what you need to do. So if men are supposed to be independent and strong and providers, when you've experienced trauma, when you have a mental health problem, and then a crisis and systems involvement, that can further undermine and exacerbate the trauma of your lifetime trauma. Having a child removed is traumatic. Divorce is traumatic. Being arrested is traumatic. Next slide, please. So also in another shout out to Carla Stover, Dr. Stover mentioned a book by Dr. Brene Brown called Daring Greatly, and said what a lovely book it is about shame and resilience. And Brene Brown's definition of shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do that makes us unworthy of connection. So if you think about it as a path, and adverse childhood experiences, trauma, historical trauma, structural racism, and mental health issues can make fathers feel like they're not doing the right thing or unable to do the right thing, or that they have failed, or that they are unworthy of connection. And next slide, please. When we experience trauma, when we experience shame, when we can't meet the ideal of the roles that we think we are supposed to fill, and we have that shame, responses to that include anger, withdrawal, avoidance, and it can feel like a loss of control. And if men are supposed to be in control, this can exacerbate that feeling of being out of control. And often when feelings of being out of control or feelings of losing power are met with anger or responded to with anger, that can also lead to violence. Stress has been shown to be associated with an increased risk for violence perpetration. And that connection, I just want to point you back to those IPV fair fathers who are in relationships where there's violence, but also have experienced just enormous amounts of trauma. So what we know then, next slide, please, is that most fathers want to be involved with their kids. They want to be good dads. They want to be part of their children's lives and give them a father. We also know that most fathers have experienced trauma, probably a lot of it. And we also know that most fathers hope for connection. Everyone hopes for connection. People want to be heard. People want to be listened to, and people want to connect. Next slide. So, as I said, the American Psychological Association has no guidelines for working with men. Like, they don't have those recommendations. And there was a review study published in 2018 that looked at articles from 2000 till 2017 and looked at all of the research and the articles that it published about working with and engaging fathers. And they found some themes in those papers I'm going to share with you today. So the strategies that the authors identified for connecting with fathers or connecting fathers are empathy and rapport building, being goal-oriented, providing education on the impact of trauma, also providing or having tangible and concrete resources, and empowerment. So next slide, please. So empathy and rapport building, I mean, I'm sure all of you know this and are aware of the importance of rapport and connection and of empathy, but it can often be hard when you have a father who is avoiding you or who is withdrawn or who is missing appointments or hard to find, and you finally do find him and you're frustrated, but leaving space for empathy, knowing that that avoidance is likely coming from a response to trauma or to shame. And we've seen, Susie mentioned the 2015 social work study in Connecticut, but we also see across the literature that there is a bias against men, generally speaking, in social services. There's a study among homeless men, and men reported a lack of empathy from service providers and reported that their interactions with service providers were negative and unsympathetic. And people experiencing homelessness often have a history of trauma, and losing one's home is a traumatic event. And again, over a third of the men, of the fathers in IPV FAIR, had experienced homelessness. One of the other ways to build rapport and engage or demonstrate empathy is with your language, and using action-oriented statements and saying things like, we're gonna fix this and we can fix this together and hard work is gonna pay off, and using words like that for the work of mental health or therapy or engagement, and we're gonna fix this so you can be with your kids, and talking about the steps that need to happen to reach interim goals. As well as holding space for trauma. I also want to talk a little bit about empowerment. I had it on the last slide, but we are often afraid to empower men, or we feel like, why should men be empowered? Because men have the power. And our own gender socialization and gendered worlds can create a perspective that makes it hard to feel like I'm going to empower this man. But remembering the pyramid of the aces and what got you involved in this father's life might help you, or might help to make room for that empowerment. Obviously, being involved with systems is a lack of control. It's having power taken away, and giving fathers positive, healthy strategies to regain some of that autonomy can be a really effective tool at engagement. However, it's important to also be aware that you don't want to collude, and you don't want to, like, if his sharing is about how terrible his partner is and how she's really responsible for everything that's wrong, it's not safe to say, yeah, you're right, she's probably terrible. And you can set limits. You don't have to agree. You just have to understand and be present and listen and not judge. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. So one thing dads know they want to be a good dad. They know what it conceptually, ideally means to be a good dad, but there's a lot of information they may be missing on what trauma is, what trauma does, about mental health. And when I'm so trauma informed, I don't mean you, I mean the people that you're working with. I know that you're trauma informed. I've seen your responses in the chat. It is clear that you are trauma informed, but lots of the fathers we're working with aren't, and allowing them or providing them with the information about how trauma has potentially impacted their life, how it could impact the lives of their child, how violence often is transmitted intergenerationally. If you grow up in a home where there is violence, it's the largest predictor of becoming involved in a violent relationship in adulthood, and the impact of trauma on relationships and how it can affect and impact trust. Next slide, please. So it's important to remember that fathers can and do change. We are in the business of creating change and providing pathways to change, but it's about that initial engagement and getting in the door. As I mentioned, when we first began the IPV FAIR program, it was complicated to work with fathers. There was a lot of questions about what that looked like. And we had, and still do, most of the fathers, it's a home-based service, and fathers might be seen in the home, but many of the fathers are seen in the office despite being a home-based service, because that's what works for the fathers and for the program. And one of the things that we've seen with IPV FAIR is once that connection is made, fathers are very likely to complete the program. When we look at reasons for discharge among the fathers involved in IPV FAIR, for families who withdraw or complete, the completion rate for fathers is 81%, which is very, very high for a social behavioral intervention. But it has been hard work to engage fathers. It still is. From the very beginning and to today, we talk at meetings about how we're going to engage fathers. The IPV FAIR has a clinician and a family navigator or case manager assigned to each family. And the case managers struggled initially. Well, dad said he didn't have any case management needs, but that conversation evolved over time. And now navigators are providing a wide range of services to fathers. We see most fathers are meeting with the navigator at least once, and many are meeting with them multiple times and receiving services. They're receiving Circle of Security, which has been great. They are receiving education and training information on child support and legal problems, but really those targeted case management needs, and not stopping when dad says, oh, I don't have any case management needs. And so again, fathers are completing IPV FAIR. And when fathers complete IPV FAIR, we see a reduction in abusive behavior. We see reductions in difficulty with emotional regulation. And the reduction in abusive behavior is based on the reports of father's partner and of, was there violence during treatment? And we also see reductions in repeat maltreatment, where fathers who complete IPV FAIR are less likely to have a report of maltreatment accepted by the department the following year. Next slide, please. So men want to be good fathers, men want to have a connection, and men have experienced trauma. And with all of those things together, providing empathy and understanding and really making room for that trauma and expecting that trauma can be a way of engaging when you allow and provide an opportunity to acknowledge the trauma, that can be a powerful experience of rapport building. And one other piece is how important it is to collect data and evaluate programs, because we don't have good strengths-based perspectives on the impact of programs for dads. And so I know that you're all engaged in this good work, and it would be great if we could have that enter the literature so we can have more of that strengths-based focus in the literature. I think that's it.
Any questions? Troy, I see you have your hand up. Troy Ellison, your hand is up. You go for it. Feel free to come off mute.
I didn't have a question per se. I was just applauding.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Susie and Rebecca. This is Polly Marston. Can you guys hear me?
Hi, Polly. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for that. I just wanted to make sure I updated the group, Dr. BEEBE and Dr. DiVietro, that the guidelines for working with boys and men has been published by the APA. That was published a couple years ago, but maybe because of the pandemic, we all missed it. So I'll be talking about that a little bit. So I just want to make sure that we understood that those have been published. It was a long time coming, to Dr. BEEBE's point. We had guidelines around other populations much earlier. So I'll talk about that tomorrow, but I just want to make sure that we had some shared understanding of that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Polly. Looking forward to your talk tomorrow.
Good morning. I have a quick question. This is William Fothergill, Central Connecticut State University. We're accumulating wonderful data to prove what we already knew. So how does this move us to solutions? So how do we begin to generate all of this information in a collective way to initiate creative change? I mean, for example, you cited the president making statements regarding, fathers and how we need to support, but still we're still lacking an initiative at the government level addressing men's health. We have that for women, but we have no formal agency at the federal level addressing men's health disparities. So how do we begin to take all of this wonderful information and put it into creative action?
That's a great question. Rebecca, do you want to take that one?
Dr. Fothergill, I think that is a really important question. And I think if I had the answer to that, I would be doing a different job probably. But I hope we can move to an answer to that. I think obviously, because of who I am and what I do, that the data collection and evaluation is a critical first step. And obviously dissemination of that information and contacting representatives and bringing that to all of the decision-making levels and applying for federal grants and just keeping to move the needle forward, because we have seen a shift. And as Polly mentioned, the guidelines did come out. So it's a slow process, but as long as we're moving forward in the process, we're engaged in it.
I'll just add, I think that too, I think collaboration is really important. I think that there's a lot of information that's being collected and it's not being necessarily shared particularly broadly. So in terms of like getting information and getting it so that people are collaborating, and movements like this conference, grassroots movements that are really important in terms of moving the needle. Also implementation science. So how do we get from what's in the literature into implementing? So needing to invest more in that implementation science would help us too. But yeah, I agree with Rebecca. That's a great question and a very hard one. I see we have some questions in the chat as well. From Winston Taylor, what's the impact of race and cooperation when provider is from a different race and culture? Any more success when working with the same culture or gender? So yes, we've definitely had literature to suggest that same gender is a bit more effective in terms of some of these interventions. That does not mean that women can't work with men and that men can't work with women. That they've been very successful in both regards, but there is some literature to speak to some success with sort of same gender pairing. Rebecca, did you want to add to that?
As well as with race and ethnicity, we've seen that as well in the data, but we have currently one male navigator in the IPV FAIR program. So it's largely women providing the service. And I don't know their demographic breakdown, but they are providing the service to a wide range to a diverse group of people. And we are still seeing those very successful completion rates and outcomes at the end of treatment. So I think, again, we have the big picture research, but I think the nuances of what it looks like in particular places, we don't have great information about that.
Diana Dutuno, I see your hand is up. Hi, Diana.
Hi, Susie. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you so much for this great presentation. I just want to share for Dr. Fothergill's question, some information that the commissioner had spoke about today with the CFI being part of the Aspen Institute's Learning and Action Community on Fatherhood. The report is available on the Aspen Institute, but that is hopefully going to be pushed forward at the federal level and with the philanthropic community and others to help with really the supports around this work, the funding aspect that is always what we struggle with. We have a wonderful infrastructure in our state, and one of our domain committees is focused on policy and public awareness. And part of what we're looking to do is to better inform our own legislators here in Connecticut about this amazing, network of folks who are all working hard to better support fathers and families, which also supports mothers. And we're currently actually working on a one-pager because DSS had submitted a legislative proposal, and we're looking for support in passage of that to really reflect the infrastructure we have as a statewide initiative. And there's so many people right now on this conference that are a part of that initiative. And anybody that's doing that work is considered part of that network. So we are working, and we hear constantly the struggle around, we know all of this great stuff. How do we get people to listen so that it's supported through actual dollars? And we've been asking at the federal level for years about dedicated funding around this population so that they're included in any family funding. Just wanted to share that.
Thanks, Diana. Raven, I see your hand is up as well.
Morning, everyone. First, I just want to say again, thank you guys for that presentation. But I just want to share, as a social worker, I work with a lot of adolescents and a lot of kids that don't have either that father engagement or that relationship with their fathers. And so hearing this data and this information and connecting that with the work that I do, I think is very important. So I just want to thank you guys for all of that.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. I see there was another question in the chat. So how do we reach men and support them before they're in crisis? Another excellent question. I think that part of what the difficulty is, as we mentioned, with sort of changing these ideas of fatherhood, but not changing the ideas of masculinity. So to the extent that we can reframe masculinity and do things to involve men in lots of different social systems, not just ones that are addressing sort of adversities. So if we can involve men in more aspects and sort of widen that idea of masculinity, that then they could potentially feel like they could be empowered to seek help when they need it. But again, this is a question that I don't know if I'm particularly well prepared to answer. But yeah, I think the goal is to make it so that to increase that engagement, that then the crises don't happen, that they get help before it turns into a crisis.
And continuing the work to reduce the stigma around mental health and help-seeking behavior.
And then is the effect of patriarchy taken into the account in the research model? I love that question. I feel like I like to talk about patriarchy all the time. So I don't know if the effect is taken into the research model. So I'm not sure which research model, but I think that we exist in a patriarchy. And so our research is, of course, informed by that patriarchy. And so it's important to keep in mind, even just the information that we're collecting is in some ways biased, right? And so it's always going to be biased by the patriarchy. So even just what counts as data and the data that we collect is part of that patriarchal perspective. But the extent to which we, institute something that directly measures it and includes it in the research model, I'm not sure if we're there yet. Any other questions or thoughts, comments? Some great comments in the chat. Well, thank you so much for inviting us for today. This was a really great experience. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you again, Dr. BEEBE and Dr. DiVietro, for your great presentation.